All right there, welcome everybody. It's Wednesday, 3 p.m. Eastern. My name's Scott Maier. This is Drawing Together with Artists Network. So I want to welcome you all. As you can see, I'm in a new space this week. I kind of moved back into the Artists Network offices here in Colorado. So I'm actually streaming now from our offices. Very excited to have you all with me today to tackle this subject. And so you can see the image that we're working from today, right below me, is rather complicated. And so that's the whole challenge that I'm presenting this week, is how do we tackle something that's so complex like this? And as you can see, I have a start here. So my anticipation and my goal here is to break this into two parts. So we'll start it this week and we'll finish it next Wednesday. And that accomplishes a few things. One of the first things it accomplishes is we just kind of need more time with this subject. There's so much to kind of dig into. And the other thing is it helps to reinforce one of the things that I've talked about a lot in this series, but I've never actually demonstrated. That's the idea of setting it aside, taking some time to evaluate it, and then coming back to the drawing. And so with this in mind, what I'm hoping for is as we can get it started, we can take some time, come back to it fresh next week, and then continue on, and we can make some adjustments to things that maybe we overlooked at the beginning in this first stage. So I just want to kind of put that out there. We're not actually going to complete a drawing today, or at least I'm not going to complete one, but my intention is to complete this next week and kind of just set the stage for this. So on that note, if you're new, I want to welcome you, and I want to let you know that this show is all about us drawing together. So I've chosen this subject to help us develop a skill in a particular way, and that is, again, to tackle this complex subject. But feel free to work in whatever medium you'd like, or kind of approach it however you would like. And this is all about sharing ideas and observations. So if you see something happening in my work that you have a question about, feel free to throw that out in the chat. If you have an alternate kind of way that you tackle a subject like this, I really want to hear that. So let us know in the chat how you go about solving this complex problem, right? And feel free to share ideas. That's what, again, this is what it's all about. I'll be working with charcoal today. So this is actually, I believe it's the Coventry rag provided by Legion Paper. But this is a cotton rag paper, fairly smooth. It has some tooth to it. I have charcoal pencils, so I've got a couple soft charcoal pencils that I'll probably be bringing in at the end of the show today. I'll be primarily drawing with these, so these are the vine charcoal sticks that I'll be working with. I've got my trusty blending stump that I'll be working with, as well as a paper towel. And for my erasers, I've got my standard Kneaded eraser, as well as a couple rubber erasers. So I have my Derwent retractable one that I have shaved down to a kind of a sharp chisel tip. And then I have this Mono Zero eraser made by Tombow that also allows for kind of some fine detail, because there's a lot of kind of sharp edges here that we might be able to get into. Most of the refinement and all those details, though, that's going to be coming next week. But it's all about setting the stage for that, is getting us to a position where we're not overwhelmed by all the information in this scene, and we can tackle it in a controlled manner. And this is something that I really need to practice. We've been doing a lot of drawings that are done in one shot, and by really upping the game a little bit in terms of the complexity, it's going to put my head in a very different space. And I want to kind of talk through not only what I'm doing on the page, but what is happening in my mind as I go through. And I would love to hear what's happening in yours. So kind of tell me, like, what strategies, again, not just the techniques you're using, but what are the mental strategies that you use to keep yourself from getting overwhelmed by all of this information? So Tammy is asking if I think you can draw that. I absolutely do think you can draw that. Now, the question is what expectations do you have for yourself in terms of capturing everything? So the reality is that we can create a drawing very quickly that will capture the essence of this scene. And it's going to miss a lot of detail, but is that really what's most important in the drawing? That's something that you're going to have to answer for yourself and establish those goals about where you want this to go, and again, what those expectations are. That's part of those mental games that we're going to be playing. So Sue is saying, like, do one section at a time. I think that's an interesting approach as well. Kind of breaking it down into kind of a series of smaller drawings that then might tie together. What size is my paper? Mary B is asking. This is 10 by 12 and a quarter. So it's the same dimensions as the reference image you have, the same aspect ratio, but it's a little bit larger. I wanted to give myself a little bit more room to maneuver. So something that's complex like this, there's a point at which getting too large becomes challenging because you just have to fill so much space. But also getting too small becomes equally challenging because you're trying to fit more information into that small space. And the smaller you go, the less forgiving your drawing will be with regards to proportions. When you're working small, if you're off by 1/8 of an inch, it's going to be noticeable. If you're working large, 1/8 of an inch, you may not even recognize. So it's all about proportions and how those marks relate to the overall dimensions of your work. Again, want to welcome everybody. And then Tammy's saying, has a good thing of having this today. Cataract surgery tomorrow. I really hope that goes well. I'll be thinking about you. Let's see. Hello, hello. I see some new names, so I want to welcome you if you haven't typed in the chat where you're viewing from. I love to hear that as well. Devashnu, welcome. Speaking Hindi, awesome. So we get people from all over the world. I see P. Mario from Spain. We have Tom Carr from England. We've got people all over the US, so welcome. So just a little bit about the setup. I have this overhead camera that's capturing this view here. And so when I'm looking ahead at you, that's what I'm seeing. I'm seeing the same screen that you're seeing. And I'm using that as a tool to help me evaluate the drawing, especially with regards to perspective. Because with the drawing in front of me, I'm compensating for the slope of the paper, and it's going to distort my understanding of the drawing. And so I need to be able to tip it up vertically, and that's what the screen is providing for me because of that overhead camera. Now to my left, though, is where the chat is and where my large reference image is that I'm going to be working from. So if I'm looking off screen, that's what I'm looking at. Okay, so let's get to it. Again, I'm working with charcoal, but you feel free to use whatever material you'd like. The process that I like to go through, and for many of you who have been with me for a while, is I like to start with a gesture. And what that gesture is my initial response to the subject. I'm not thinking about measuring, calculating, placing any objects properly. I'm just reacting to the subject. Because my understanding of the subject right now is very surface level. I haven't taken time to analyze it. That analyzation is going to happen through the drawing process, or that analysis is going to happen through the drawing process. So I'm kind of offloading any sort of pressure on myself right now to get everything right. I just want to kind of loosen up, moving my arms a lot to help kind of connect myself to my body a little bit more. And while I'm just creating these loose marks, I figure I might as well start to think through some of the subject. And I'm saying the subject, not the subjects, not plural. My goal right now is to see this as one thing. And to help me get there, I am looking at the subject through a really relaxed gaze. So everything is soft and out of focus right now. So, and I'm looking at the small thumbnail that's right below me on the screen. And when I do that, all I see is an arrangement of light and dark, right? And it makes it difficult for me to identify specific objects because it's just all blurry. And so and I think as some of you kind of alluded to, there's so much going on here, it can be overwhelming. And I've certainly experienced that sense of panic when you confront something that's really complicated and overwhelming like this. And my initial response when I would start drawing would be to really kind of focus and just kind of zero in on one thing and move to the next and move to the next. And that worked to some degree, but what I found would happen when I would do that is that I would complete the drawing moving from one spot to the next, and by the time I got back around to the beginning, none of them quite lined up. And then there was also a sense of sharpness to the drawing that became overwhelming to view. So there was just so much information that it just made it difficult to make sense of. And it almost became like work for viewers to look at the paintings or the drawings that I was doing. And so that has, through that and through studying a lot of other artists and through, lots of practice, I've landed on this process of trying to start with major shapes and start by the shapes of light and shadow as much as possible. It's the light that unifies everything, right? And we've talked about that in this series before, is that so much of the art making process is about balancing the unity, the idea that everything belongs together, and divisions on the page. The more division you have, the more contrast you have on your surface, the more exciting it's going to be. But you run the risk of things feeling like they don't quite belong together. So then we try to unify them, we try to bring them together. So what I did here by wiping down is that I'm making all of these marks here on the surface. Each mark you make is a division on the surface. And then by wiping them down, it starts to unify that a little bit more. And so then we'll kind of build up the drawing, and then we'll wipe it down, we'll build it up and wipe it down, and we'll end up ultimately doing essentially hundreds of drawings just directly on top of one another. And each time we do that, we're going to come to a deeper understanding of the subject that'll be perhaps more accurate. So my initial stage, though, here, my initial intent is just to start by observing abstract shapes of light and dark, thinking about them as light and shadow. Light is a tricky term because we talk about it as with regards to light and shadow, but also light in terms of value, or sometimes light pressure that we're applying to the surface. So if I throw out a term and it's not as clear as it could be, please let me know so then I have the opportunity to correct it and adjust it. And then the other advantage to working this way, again, is it just helps me to calm things down in my mind a little bit and connect with what's happening here on the page. Because the truth is, calculating is a lot of work. I don't know about you guys, but when I would study math or something that would require kind of sharp focus and calculations, I would find myself getting mentally fatigued rather quickly. And the same thing happens when drawing. And so I'm trying to be strategic about when I bring in that level of focus and calculation so that I don't burn myself out right at the beginning. Because what happens is, again, I have a very surface level understanding of the subject. And if I put all my focus into it now and I haven't really taken time to process all the image internally, I'm putting myself out of sync. I'm burning through my focus at a time when I don't really have the depth of knowledge about the subject that's required or helpful. And so I'm keeping everything relaxed and starting to just put pieces of the puzzle on the page that will move around until it all falls into place. So Tom T's going to give it a try. Hello from Brazil. Hello, Jackie. We got people from all over the place. All right. Tammy, every time you see it's out of focus. I think about that a lot, is the role that essentially our control over our eyes, our pupils, our irises, like what we do mechanically with our eyes can play a big role in how we observe the subject and how we interpret that information on the page. So there are, again, I'm just looking at everything with soft focus right now. And when I squint, that limits the amount of light that comes into my eyes, and I start to perceive the subject a little bit differently. I'm taking in a little bit more information when I squint. When I let my eyes lose focus, it's almost like I'm focusing on a either a place that's really far beyond the subject or in front of the subject. And can start to observe very subtle variations in the subject that way. And then when I look very sharply and focused, it changes things a little bit. And when I open my eyes wide to flood them with light, yet keep my eyes relaxed, again, it changes the subject a little bit differently. So what I'm doing is I'm constantly changing that up to give myself a more comprehensive look at value relationships and shapes and things like that. So, and also, again, by softening the gaze and seeing these just as abstract forms, I'm not connecting with these objects as definable, items, as definable objects. I'm looking at them as just as shapes of light and dark, and that keeps my brain from getting overloaded with all the information. So from this gesture, we'll start to make calculations. And so again, I'll walk you through my process. Let me know how things are going for you, how you might be starting. You might be more inclined to start with a grid, for example, and then use that as a way to guide. We'll actually be creating somewhat of a grid through the use of plumb lines and horizontal guides in the drawing process, but I don't use an actual grid. Whew, all right. And it does help. I do feel like I have some advantage in that I'm talking through this. And so if you find it helpful for yourself, talk out loud, get that out verbally to help keep yourself organized. And I'll sometimes do kind of wonky things, like if I'm kind of in a general area and it gets confusing. So when I'm looking up at the subject, sometimes I have to take a beat to orient myself, or where am I? Because there's so much stuff going on. So what I might do is actually point at the subject and keep this arm fixed to help me come back to that subject, come back to that same spot. Or I'll talk out loud, this is what I'm doing now, and it becomes kind of a verbal commitment to myself that helps me to not lose focus on where I'm at and not kind of fall into that part of my brain that wants to dig into all of those fun details. Now, throughout this whole series, I've started my drawings this way, but at this point I would start to measure things out. Since we're stretching things out over 2 weeks, and there's so much information here, I'm sticking with the gesture drawing a little bit more. But as I'm going through this, I'm starting to make mental note of how I'm reacting to the drawing. And I can start to see the ghostly image of this studio take form here, and that's exciting. Because this is what I said earlier, is you could complete a drawing of this very complicated subject in just a matter of minutes or even less. Now that drawing may not have accurate proportions, or it may have very little detail, but it can be an exciting drawing. There's a lot of abstract qualities that can be conveyed in a simple gesture drawing. Just arrangements of light and dark shapes that are placed pleasingly on the page. There's a balance to them. There's something that inspires a viewer to kind of fill in missing information. And so there are some artists that might stop at this stage and call it good. And you might find that that's what works for you. I think I want to start to dig into it a little bit more. I love this. It looks like some sort of kiln right here that becomes like a central focal piece. But what I'm trying to do right now is I'm kind of fluctuating back and forth between starting to identify some of these shapes, and then again, through the soft focus, it allows me to see everything at once. So I'm trying to go in and look at a shape and then back out and look at it as a whole. And my priority is on getting these big shapes of value right first. Because when I look at this with sharp focus, one of the things that stands out is this picture frame that's sitting on the easel. It becomes very clear to me. But when I soften my gaze and I squint, all of a sudden it falls into shadow, and it's just a few little lighter shapes, but generally it's actually pretty dark, and it's quite a bit darker here than the light on the floor. And so those are some of the just kind of the big decisions that I'm starting to identify that might come into play later on. When I squint, this whole corner kind of falls into shadow, and those legs on the easel become obscured. So I'm not trying to get the values correct. I'm looking at just trying to get the major shapes correct, and then we'll continue to adjust the specific values as we go through. Hello from Mexico. All right, Sylvia, it's very intimidating, I know. I guess that's the whole point. I just hope everybody, if you're intimidated, that you're being kind to yourself. That's kind of the whole point of this drawing process, is we're practicing, and the expectation I have for myself is that I'm going to come away with some deeper understanding of the drawing process, not a perfect drawing. And if I do want that to be, if I want a perfect drawing to be my goal, I need to be really clear about what qualities that drawing has. Because perfection to you might be different than perfection to me, and it might be different than somebody else. So for me, like maybe getting the values 100% right and the main shapes, that's what's perfect. Or maybe it's getting every little detail. Or, who knows? There's a lot of different aspects to art that you might find most relevant. So I think one of the things that I've struggled with in the past is not being clear on the expectations I have of myself, and just getting frustrated because I didn't like the drawing. But I didn't give myself a clear direction and an objective. And sometimes it's really challenging to do that, and it just takes time you need to draw. But just be free to make marks, enjoy the process, and know that this is only one step in what could be a lifetime of drawing for you. There's no real logic to the things that I'm reacting to at this point. It really is just a reaction, an initial reaction. I think I need to do this. I don't have a reason really for doing that. I just felt like it was time for the drawing to, essentially I'm kind of I don't want to say starting over. I guess I technically am, but like I said earlier, I almost feel like what I want to do is create 100 drawings of this. So I've done several now. I'm wiping it down. Now I'm going to take another stab at it, but I'm starting from a different place of understanding about the subject. And I'm intentionally sticking with the gesture here. Because each time I kind of take a stab through, I kind of notice a little bit more about the drawing. I think this is going to become the focal point. Not only is it centered in the photograph, but I like the arrangement of those shapes and the complexity of the shapes with the way the two chairs come together, especially with this kiln kind of behind it. So I'm just kind of going through and making kind of abstract notes. And even though I just defined these as chairs, I'm trying to see them as abstract forms. Using the side of the charcoal when appropriate to fill in a large area. Hello, Ursula. Ray W. Wow, I did not know I knew so much, but my problem was that I did not understand it. Interesting. It's an interesting comment. So, yeah, if anybody's feeling really lost right now, I'm kind of with you. I'm a little lost, and that's why I'm not trying to get myself caught in the weeds. The way I think about it with focusing in detail is that, in the past, I had the experience of getting lost in the woods. When I lived up in Alaska, I went backpacking, had this guidebook that was telling me, here's where the trail is, following along the trail, and it's beautiful, just dense woods, and I'm just watching the world around me, and I feel like I'm on this path, walking for several hours, just in my space, just following the path. And every now and then it would branch off, and I'm like, I'm going to keep following the path that I'm on. Next thing I know, I'm in the completely wrong spot because I had branched off on this moose trail that looked like a substantive path. And I had a really hard time getting myself back. It was just a web of these moose trails that I wasn't really aware of at the time. And so I kind of think about that sometimes. Like if I had taken time throughout that process to really stop and evaluate the big picture to make sure I was on that right path, I would have made it through. But I had just kind of gotten lost in my own head and in each moment along the trail, and just kind of making an assumption as I went along that I was on the right path without really double checking it. And so I think about that experience a lot. Of course I ended up finding my way out, but it took several hours, and I had to hoof it through dense wood along this river in order to get back to my vehicle. But like I said, I think about that a lot. Like this is the stage at which I just want to be always mindful of the whole path. And then as we go through, we're going to start to become more connected with the details. Once we know that, all right, everything is mapped out properly, then we can kind of dig in and really appreciate all those little things around me. So one of the other things I'm also starting to evaluate now is just a basic understanding of the arrangement of light and dark shapes. And I'm starting to, in this stage of the gesture, before I make a mark, do a quick check-in with other landmarks in the reference image. So as I'm making, say, this shadow that's in the bookcase on the far right, doing a quick check-in with this shadow here and the basic size of the negative space that's created by this easel. I can look across here, do a quick check-in to see how it might relate to the kiln. As I'm working on the kiln, kind of doing a rough assessment of where it is laterally across here. What's the distance from each edge? And so each mark I make, before I do it, I'm essentially trying to triangulate it. At least look for one other point of reference, but 2 or 3 additional points of reference are going to give you a greater degree of accuracy. So now I'm working on, say, that shadow under the table where the chair is. I'm going to quick check in with this dark mass here, that bookcase above it. I'm going to come across here, check in here to see where it might relate to some of these dark shapes over here. So now I'm kind of creating a triangle that way, a triangle of reference. I'm trying to draw with my arm as much as possible rather than my wrist. And just looking at this dark mass here behind the easel, checking in where it is relative to the shadow here created by the kiln. Come down here and there's a shadow on the floor. There are these very subtle, they look like pottery, the throwing wheels that are leaning up against there. So I'm going to try my best to kind of make it clear what I'm observing before I place a mark. And I haven't done any measuring at this point, but we can start to do that in a little bit. These initial impulses are going to get us in the ballpark, and then from there we can start to refine. And when I'm looking at the subject, what I'm trying to do is establish essentially a proportion between how much I look at the subject and how much I look at the drawing. And at this early stage, it's about a 75-25%. I want to try to look at the subject about 75% of the time, and about 25% of the time look at the drawing itself. Because if I flip that, then what that requires me to do is to take a mental snapshot of the subject, hold that image in my mind, and then try to render it on the page. And that's a really challenging thing for me to do. So if you flip that, and if I keep my eyes fixed on the subject, I'm studying it a little bit more. I'm giving myself more time to really study that, that subject. And I'm only glancing at the page really to think about where I'm at. It's mostly about basic orientation, but I'm allowing my observations of the subject to kind of flow from my brain down my arm into the charcoal onto the surface, right? It just reacting to it, but keeping my eyes fixed on the subject as much as possible. And then throughout the drawing process, that ratio is going to change, where we're going to be doing more of a 75% of the time looking at the drawing, because so much of it will be established already. It's almost like we're giving ourselves notes for later on in the drawing process that we can rely on, so we don't have to go to the reference images quite as much, if that makes sense. Kathy's saying it's really hard to speak while you're drawing. Right brain for creative, left brain for speech. Yeah, it's interesting. I don't know whether I've just gotten used to it, but I don't really have as much of that trouble, but it was really hard at first, so perhaps it's a matter of practice. And one of the advantages that I have is that, of course, I have this drawing in front of me. I've already attempted this to some degree. I've given myself a little bit of practice. I also, I'm kind of curious to the group here. I find that listening to things, or especially like audiobooks or podcasts, I'm a huge podcast nerd, and talking is kind of essential for my focus, if that makes sense, because when in the silence, I find myself more easily distracted. It's like what I need is my conscious mind to chew on a different thing, to be focused one thing where I can just, and the rest of me can just be free to draw. And I've always struggled with that because I know some people that, are adamant about, just pure silence to connect with the art making process, or maybe classical music, things like that. And I find that what happens is that in all of that, I get in my head so much that I lose my way. And so it's like I need part of my brain to kind of be chewing on another problem so that I can stay focused on the drawing, if that makes sense. It kind of helps me cut down the mental chatter that ultimately gets in the way of my way of drawing. But again, that may be just particular to me. I'm curious what you all do to help manage that inner voice while you're working. I love charcoal too. I love getting my hands dirty. It feels really good. I know a lot of my students, when I would teach, they would, it would vary widely. Some students were really uncomfortable with the feeling of charcoal. So if you are, I totally get it. I just love it. Okay, so now I'm kind of observing this dark triangular shape, but I want to connect it to some of these other forms. So I'm being a little bit more delicate with the touch right now. And so with this vine charcoal, you can see that it's really been flattened on one side. So I have this sharp edge. So it's just a matter of kind of rolling it when I need a sharp edge and rolling it back on a flat edge if I need something that's more broad. And so it can be helpful to develop kind of an intuitive understanding of what's happening at the point of contact between your material and the paper. So being aware of flat spots on either your graphite or your charcoal, and I don't know of any real training for that as much as just practicing, but that is something that I think about. I realize is a subconscious program that's kind of running in the background of my mind, is being aware of the shape that this is making and how that might affect the marks that I'm making. So again, I have everything soft, out of focus, just looking at these large shapes, and I'm starting to really understand the sense of light and shadow in this scene. And again, it's the light and shadow that unifies everything. So I'm starting from that point of unification, and then we'll gradually be dividing it to create the objects that sit within this shape of light and shadow. So we've talked about these different shadow terms before, but there are three main shadow terms that you want to be aware of. There's the form shadow. That's the part of the object that is shaded. So there would be a light side and a shadow side. That shadow side is the form shadow. That object casts a shadow as well. And so again, now you have the form shadow and you have the cast shadow. You bring those two shapes together, that forms what I call a shadow shape, or what's called a shadow shape. And that's really what I'm looking for at this point, or what are the large shadow shapes? And that might mean that we end up creating shapes that overlap various objects. And I found that ultimately works better for me than outlining or creating contour lines of objects and then trying to shade, because those contour lines start from a point of division that you're then trying to work throughout the drawing process to unify through the shading that you apply to that drawing. So this reverses that process by starting from the unification of the light and shadow, and then we'll divide it farther. And I think the reason it works for me is that it takes me time to really understand the subject. Each time I make a pass through this drawing, I'm starting to understand the proportions, the relationships between objects a little bit more. I'm taking in a little bit more information. And if I start with an initial line drawing, it kind of puts me in a place of having to understand all of that rather quickly. And I just need a little bit more time to figure that out. And using the drawing process helps me to get there. All right, now this is going to be a fun part. Look at all that stuff. I am really having a hard time figuring out what's going on there, but I'm going to trust the process and just keep my eyes soft and out of focus and just look at shapes. It's all very complicated. Holy smokes, there's a lot going on. And if you are new, you're going to want to know that you can also share your work when you're done. So what you can share after this is your initial, your start to this drawing, your initial stages. And you can share that on a link that I pinned to the top of the chat, or it's in the description for the video below. And that'll take you to the artistnetwork.com drawing together page for this episode. And that could be really helpful. If you do post there and you're looking for specific feedback, feel free to put that in there and maybe indicate what you're looking for. I generally don't provide any sort of feedback or criticism beyond, a lot of these drawings are really awesome and I like them, so I like to say that. But if I don't want to provide suggestions for improvement unless it's been asked for. So I think it's intimidating enough to put your work out there, and it amplifies the intimidation factor to get unsolicited feedback to say, hey, this needs to be better, or that's not very good, especially if it's not constructive feedback. So that's my kind of take on it. How you deliver feedback, how you ask for it, it's a bit of an art that takes some practice. Okay, so as I'm going through this, I'm starting to become aware of this bookcase that we're kind of just seeing a little bit on the right-hand side. There's going to be a few factors that I'll need to pay attention to later on. One of them being the perspective. So we have these shelves that kind of lead in this direction, and there's a changing kind of angle to each of those that I want to be aware of. Right now, though, I'm just using basic angle sighting. I'm just feeling that out, just kind of drop in a line that feels largely correct, and then when I get to adding the details there, that's when I'll really focus on dialing in that perspective. So let's see. Oh, Tom Teacher says, yes, listening to you during the drawing and watching at the same time is very beneficial. That's good to hear. And then Arlie is saying the same thing. Thank you for that comment. I'm with you in that too. I need to work on my mind, keep my mind busy so I can be free to work intuitively. Yeah, that's awesome. And then Jean is saying, I frequently listen to audiobooks while I work. It loosens me up. That's awesome. Yeah, audiobooks and podcasts. I have a hard time with music for some reason now, listening to music while I work. I think it puts me in my head a little bit. Again, there's something about a book or a storyline that allows that part of my brain that creates the mental chatter, again, to kind of just play over there so the other part of my brain that draws can do what it does, or paints too. So, all right, so this is going to be really tricky, and I noticed that in the preparatory drawing for this is that this is a really complicated area. And it's difficult to even observe through blurred vision. So when I let my eyes lose focus, this section here is murky. I'm having a hard time locking onto a general value because it's a mingling of dark and light shapes that mix optically at a distance to create this grayish tone. So I'm kind of articulating that verbally here because I think that's part of my desire to be a little bit kind to myself and prepare myself to this really hard spot. All right, so as I'm working in here and I'm looking at some of those basic shapes, I need to do a quick check-in. I've given myself basic indicators of this chair and of this easel with the picture frame on it. And I want to make sure that those relationships are effective. There's this kind of loose area here. The cushion of the chair really stands out. Now, I haven't done any subtractive drawing at this point with the eraser, but I'll be bringing that out soon. This is also a really good challenge to develop your skill of the positive and negative spatial relationships. The idea that you're looking at the subject, the object, as well as the space created around it. So looking at this chair, for example, there's a positive space of the chair, but then there's a negative space of these dark forms through the back slats there. And if you haven't really spent much time doing negative drawing, you might take a little bit of time at this early stage to try to flip that thinking a little bit. And so intentionally kind of build that focus. So instead of thinking about the object that's your target, look at the shape of the space around it. And it's difficult in a complex scene like this because it's easy to think of positive and negative space when it's a singular object. And you can say, like, the positive space is the object, the negative space is just that blank space around it. But in this case, the negative space is often full of other stuff too. And so it gets really overwhelming. So if I look at the negative space over here, that we see through the window of this, I guess it's not a picture frame, it looks like a stretcher bar, or perhaps a strainer for a canvas. But you can see there's the hole in there, but then there's stuff through the hole. And it gets really complicated, but that's where kind of building an intuition for that can be helpful, and just intentionally trying to fluctuate back and forth between observing the positive space and the negative space. So doing a little bit of subtractive drawing only with my finger. I haven't used the eraser to draw yet. Do a quick angle sight because I want to get the angle of this, the bar there on the easel correct. Come across from there, and that's largely in line with the bottom of the cushion. So that brings that chair up a little bit. And again, I'm not getting into the details right now because I just made a fairly significant change in the placement of that chair based on the observation of the relationship between the easel and the chair itself. Had I gone through and rendered anything, I would have had essentially lost all that time. And so it can get uncomfortable sometimes sticking with these initial gestures for as long as I'm doing. But I've found that with these complex subjects, the longer I sit with these initial gestures, the faster those details will come into formation later on in the process. So, and again, I'm sticking with the vine charcoal right now. I find that it's just softer and more accommodating to changing. It almost feels like I'm drawing in sand to some degree, which is a little bit comforting because it allows me comfort in knowing that I can quickly just wipe it out, almost like an Etch-a-Sketch, just shake it up and start over again. But again, we're not really starting over from scratch. If we were to wipe this down right now, we would be starting over with all the history of knowledge that we've put into this drawing at this point. So we get to another kind of rendering of the subject more easily. So I'm kind of looking at these negative spaces between the legs of this easel. And that what's really kind of fascinating is that just as abstract shapes, we have this dark vertical here surrounded by some lighter objects. It gets dark here. We come down here, this is a little bit lighter than that. And we come down, and then this is now darker than that. Although, we would need to make sure that that feels continuous, but there's this interplay between the light and dark relationships between the shapes. And so again, I'm not thinking about dialing in the specific values as much as making really broad statements about the overall relationship between the values. What's lighter, what's darker? I want to look at this basic angle difference here. So if you're not familiar with angle sighting, it's a really powerful tool. For those of you who have been with the show for a long time, this will be old news and you're probably tired of me talking about it, but I want to make sure that I'm benefiting those who are new. Angle sighting is a process by which you transfer the angle of one object onto your drawing. So you're just comparing the slope, the angle of one aspect of your subject to your drawing. So to do that, if you close one eye, you flatten your depth perception. So when I hold out my stick of charcoal here, I can close one eye and it appears to be directly on top of my subject. Actually, I'm going to use the large references off to my left. I'm going to align it with this slope here, lock my wrist, carry it over, and now I can observe it directly on top of my drawing, the one that's being captured by the camera above me. And so that way I can compare one-to-one the angle, the slope of each of these legs, the slope here of that little shelf there, as well as that horizontal support. And then the slope here of the kind of top of the easel. And so it's all very subtle, but there's a subtle kind of change in angle with these horizontals that create that sense of perspective. And I'm kind of taking a mental note of that more than really dialing in those angles in. We'll come back and double check those again later. There's this little picture frame here. I'm going to do a quick check-in to make sure that I'm relating to this object a little bit better. If you are new, you're going to want to know that also that this goes up as a recording later. This is episode 113, so there's 112 other episodes. So if you're just kind of getting into this, you can jump in at any one of those episodes. We choose a new subject each week, and we intentionally challenge ourselves so that we grow in particular ways. And we're typically we're working in graphite or charcoal, but most of the things that we talk about can be applied really in any medium. But the idea with this show is that we're just trying to take some time to dedicate to our growth in drawing, and then it might, and hopefully what it does is that it will kind of play out in other aspects of our artistic career. So if I want to go out and paint, it will help me by building hand-eye coordination, understanding proportions a little bit more quickly and accurately. So I'm starting to divide things a little bit more, giving myself a little bit more information, and this will help me to start to evaluate the major proportions a little bit. So as I started to drop in a little bit more information in this area, if I'm going through that, or if I'm going across here and there's this, I don't know, some sort of box here, there's some shadow and there's a light kind of bottle, there's another case of some sort, and then there's a vase or vase, and then we're in shadow over here. If I'm going through that and it doesn't feel like anything's going to fit, then it's going to cause me to look at the width of this object, this kiln, a little bit more critically. And when I squint, this edge disappears when I'm looking at the subject or at the reference photo. This edge disappears, which tells me that those values are actually similar to one another, and I had created too much of a division there. I'd made that edge too visible. So I want to kind of step back a little bit and make sure that I'm really observing the shapes of light and shadow a little better. Make sure I'm not dividing too much. Now then there's a light shape that comes down here, so that corner kind of pops out of the shadow. So this is, a large part of what we're going to be doing for a little while now is kind of moving back and forth between really studying an individual object and then stepping back and observing the entire play of light and shadow in the scene to make sure everything is unified. And now this is very similar to how I would probably paint this subject as well. Starting with just these large masses and these abstract arrangements of light and dark, and then try to explore subtle and nuanced shapes within the scene, and kind of be in control of where I want to have more refined edges. So I'm starting to calculate a little bit more, but again, not as much. I don't want to burn myself out at this stage by focusing too much. And I'm not quite ready there. I'm still setting the stage. Holy smokes, there's a lot going on that table. I'm kind of just now realizing that. And I would be lying if I said I'm 100% confident that this drawing is going to come together. There is part of me that's panicking a little right now because there is so much information. But I don't know, I think it's exciting at the same time. There's a lot going on in there. So I'm, again, keeping my eyes soft and out of focus when I'm looking at that. But I'm trying to react more to kind of subtle subtle shapes of light and dark. So when we initiated the drawing, we're thinking about the broad shapes of light and dark. Now we want to keep that same thinking just in smaller areas as we move along. And so I'm a little bit more confident in the scale of those larger shapes. So now once I get in there, I can add increasingly smaller and delicate shapes and be thinking more about the relationship between them just in that small area, and know that as a whole it's going to fit together. Now I'm going to step back, look at the whole drawing, see how it's all coming together. I feel like in general I'm in decent shape. I'm not seeing anything that majorly off. I need to be careful with these chairs. They're going to be really tricky. I just kind of know from experience that if I focus on the contour edges too much, going to overstate the edges, it's going to flatten everything out. So I'm just, again, when I'm squinting or I'm blurring my vision, I'm trying to react to what's standing out and just focus on those. And so if there's a leg that I don't even observe, I'm not going to draw it just because I know it's there. I feel like, especially in my early attempts at drawing, so much of what I was trying to do was combat that part of my brain that just assumed that it understood how things looked and how it should be drawn. You know, I realized that I was drawing from this mental construct I had in my head, and not really looking. I'm not using my powers of observations and digging deep into understanding what I'm actually observing. And simply just reacting to the drawing itself. It's like I'm reacting to the drawing, and the drawing is feeding the image, and that adjusts my drawing even more. And I've kind of, by the end of the drawing, just like that analogy of getting lost in the woods, my drawing is in a very different place than what the actual subject is. And so it took some practice to really shift my focus onto the whole here, and really coming back to what is the subject really telling me? What assumptions can I question and address? And how can I use the process of mark making to come to a deeper understanding of the object, knowing that the deeper I understand the object, the stronger the drawing might become. One of the challenges is that our minds, the way I understand how we process visual information based on the limited scientific research that I've tried to understand, is that there are three main pathways through which our visual information passes as our mind tries to interpret that signal. So if everything starts as wavelengths of light, it passes through the lens of our eye into the retina, where these photosensitive cells translate the vibration, the photons that are vibrating in a particular way. It translates that into an electrical impulse or an electrical signal that then travels to another part of our brain, and it passes through a few different stages. So there's one part of our brain that would interpret that information just as raw data. There's another part of our brain that would interpret it based on its usefulness, essentially. What is it called? How do we use this? What do we do with this thing? And then another part of our brain would take that same information and interpret it based on how it might make us feel or our past associations with it. And it often can all get really muddy which part of our brain we're allowing our drawing to originate from. And almost what I'm trying to do now is shed the part of my brain that's identifying what the object is, try to get rid of any sort of emotional connection with it, and just take it in as though I've never observed anything before, right? I have no understanding what this is. And then out of that, if I can kind of reverse engineer that process, I can create a drawing that will then have a sense of optical truth to it, that will trigger something in the viewer's mind, that will activate that part of their brain that is emotional, right? That interprets it on an emotional level. And they won't kind of get caught in that part of the brain that is understanding it from a core level. If the drawing is wildly inaccurate, then it might get stuck. It may not be able to get to that emotional level because it can't. That raw data doesn't make sense. If that's all landing, I'm not really sure if I'm making sense here. But that's kind of where my head's at in all of this, is that in order to not get overwhelmed by all of this, I'm just trying to just kind of shut down that part of my brain that thinks it knows what's happening. Because we're really good at that. We take a mental snapshot in a split second, the smallest fraction of a second, we can take in all this optical information, and our subconscious mind tells us exactly what it is. And we don't have to go in and study this. If we were to enter the studio, we wouldn't question that we're in an artist studio. It would just all make sense. But if we didn't have that part of our brain, if we didn't have our brain working in that way, if we were to encounter this and it was just pure raw data that we had no context for it, it would be overwhelming. We would have to go through this all of these stages of calculation to try to figure out what it is we're looking at, how it all fits together, etc. Our brain solves all of that. So the drawing process is all we're trying to do is we're slowing that split second down into potentially hours, where we're taking time to really understand what is that information that we're perceiving that tells us that we're in this space, and it leads to that emotional response to the space itself. So hopefully that kind of makes sense, and I didn't just make things entirely confused and you're saying just be quiet so I can draw. And if it would be better for me to be quiet for a bit, I'm willing to take that observation. Okay, so as I'm going through here, I feel like I'm encountering some elements that are going to require me to start to do some subtractive drawing. So I'm going to get into that a little bit. But all right, let me see. Whew. That was a fun tangent. I hope I could talk about that for hours, but I hope that wasn't just a distraction from me. I'm sorry, I got out of track here, and I want to get back to some of the comments that are coming up. So Kay is asking a question: when drawing with charcoal, do you prefer smooth or textured paper? I prefer, I guess, smoother paper. I really like working with a cotton rag paper. So cotton rag papers generally have a tooth to them, but it's not a strong texture. It needs to have some sort of tooth because the charcoal needs to be able to hold on to something. So a smooth, like a Bristol board or a vellum, kind of gets hard. Like it either will fall off the surface or it'll actually just be embedded into the paper, and it's hard to erase off. So I like this rag paper for that reason. Tammy's saying mine looks good already. I think mine is doomed. What? You could. Oh, you didn't use vine charcoal. I'm kind of curious how yours looks. Yeah, I'm sticking with the vine charcoal for now. Oh my gosh, that's lifting off a lot. So now I have my blending stump, and even though it's pretty well used and it's loaded with charcoal, it's lifting a bunch now. So I need to be a little careful with that. So with the blending stump, remember, it's always an opportunity to contribute to the form. So think about drawing with it. Now this is picking up more than it's laying down, so I need to use this subtractively until I load it with more charcoal. I'm going to load it here, so really light touch with that. Oh man. You know what I think I need to do is switch to the compressed charcoal because it's really lifting at this point. Let me try to just smooth things out a little bit. I'm going to be a little bit more gentle. And what I need to do is pay attention to what my blending stump is doing. If it's lifting, if it's just smoothing, if it's and then paying attention to the texture, because I don't want to lose too much information. Now I could wipe it down with my paper towel, but that would be a bit too aggressive at this stage. I would lose all of this information. And I'm actually pretty happy with the way this is developing. So what I'm doing now is just smoothing out some of the marks here. Leave that on there. So these really dark areas, it's kind of lifting more than anything. And I've overstated some of these forms, but this is really just setting the stage for some subtractive drawing, where I'll use my eraser to lift off some of those light shapes. Everything's getting a little murky here. Thinking about edges as well. So softening that edge, because that shadow is really soft in that area. Some of these shadow forms get a little bit more clear, more explicit. And when I'm working with a blending stump, I'm allowing it to kind of roll in my fingers as I go. So as I'm moving back and forth, it's constantly rotating in my fingers to kind of more evenly distribute it on the tip. Oh my gosh, I think it's time for me to get some new blending stumps. This one's been pretty well used, but I'm going to pull that tip back out. And what I like about using the blending stump too, not only does it just help to smooth out some of these areas, but I can make some notes on the page that are a little bit more gentle than the charcoal. And so especially as I work in some of these complicated areas that are really loaded with information, I can make some statements about what's there with a little bit more delicacy. Let's see. And here I may say, I'm finding that I'm too heavy-handed with the charcoal and pencil. That's one of the reasons I like to start with the vine charcoal, is that it helps to make the paper a little bit more receptive to compressed charcoal later. So I certainly get that with the charcoal. It can feel like a very aggressive medium. All right, so I think I got a little bit out of control, a little bit overusing the vine charcoal, so I'm going to switch to the compressed charcoal now that I'm feeling fairly confident in these larger shapes. Maybe just evaluate edges again. And there's these wheels here. There's a little fabric on the floor that leaves this little shadow where it curls up and is right below this leg. I want to kind of check it across here. So, we talked earlier about a grid. A grid can help because it helps to create verticals and horizontals, so plumb lines and horizontal guides that visually connect objects together. And if you are working from a grid, I would I don't think there's anything wrong with working from a grid. I mean, however you get there, I think is fair game. I would never give anybody a hard time for using a tool that they find useful. I would just say that be open to the idea that that tool could be used in multiple ways. So if you have the mind, when you're working with a grid, to just focus on the individual squares and fit them together, try flipping it and thinking about really observing how the lines that run vertically and horizontally connect all the objects through it. So there's just a difference in thinking between the shape, the space in the grid versus the lines. And if you think about it linearly, think about the shapes, like kind of think about them back and forth. I've just found that helpful to when I think about using a tool like that to kind of challenge my use of it a little bit, to see if I can become a little bit more expansive in my understanding of that. Now, again, I don't use a grid, but I think about plumb lines and horizontal guides in a similar way. I think about the way implied lines can physically connect objects that are in a different place in space. So what a plumb line is a vertical line that runs through a drawing, and what you're observing is where that line passes through the objects below it. So if I look at this edge, for example, of this, it looks like a stretcher bar, I can come down here and I can observe where does it intersect the various elements through which it passes. And then a horizontal guide can do the same thing. So if I use this line, for example, I can carry that across and observe how does that relate to the chair. I come across and there's this, it looks like a stand, a wheel, pottery wheel or something right in here. I can see that line. Where does that pass through there? Where does it pass through this chair? Where does it pass through this dark space under the table and across all the way to here? So that horizontal guide becomes really powerful. And if you're working with a grid, you're going to have a horizontal line that cuts through all of those objects as well. So that's just my one statement about working with grids. And I know I learned from a pastel artist named Christina Ivers that she uses it's not a grid that's vertical and horizontal. There's these diagonal lines that kind of divide the subject that she then transfers to the surface for painting. All right, let's see. Oh, and Sue is saying, would hot press watercolor paper work? I don't know. In the past, I've had very little success working with watercolor paper, especially with charcoal. But at the time when I was doing that, I wasn't really paying attention to hot press and cold press. I was just grabbing, oh, this paper looks good, and I'll start drawing. And what I found is that at least at that time, it was really holding the material. It wasn't erasing down the way I wanted it to. But it's been such a long time that I've worked with a paper that's specifically designed for watercolor, because that's got a sizing in it that's intended to keep it from falling apart when wet. Now, this rag paper doesn't fall apart when wet either. It's meant for also printmaking and other things. And so watercolor paper could work, but I don't want to say yes or no without really knowing for sure. Zephy, awesome, stick to it. So Zephy is attempting a loose style in pen and ink, sort of like urban sketching. Way to go. I am very impressed that you're doing that, because I do not know as if I would have the courage to do something like this. Or really, in most drawings, I think I'd be really intimidated to work in pen and ink. So, way to go. And Jackie's did it as well. Oh, and then Susan, I'm glad that you learned something by pulling out the stump. Yeah, these are fun stumps. I never worked with blending stumps for a long time. Okay, I got a little distracted here. What am I doing? All right, I'm going to do some subtractive drawing. So I'm going to use my retractable eraser. Again, I took a razor blade and I kind of cut it off so it has a sharp edges and points. And I'm going to start just kind of reacting to some of the shapes. Now, I'm using this shallow angle here because that allows me, just like in a pencil, to be able to scrape across the surface or really dig in and grind in on an edge. And so, so I'm not losing that sharp point, and I can control the pressure a little bit more. I'm just using it on its side with a light touch. And if I need a sharper edge or more control, I can kind of lean in on it a little bit more. So again, that's very similar to how I work with the charcoal itself. And I just start with the weight of the material to see what it does, and you can see that it's picking up charcoal on there. So with very little pressure, an eraser becomes an effective tool for smudging or blending. And then as you bear down on it, it starts to give you a little bit more lift there. I want to really kind of observe that angle, because I think I overstated this angle here. So when working with straight lines, Try to lock your wrist as much as possible. Draw from the shoulder if you can. That might help with straight lines. Okay, so let me, and again, I'm not worried about getting the values accurate. I'm looking at establishing light and dark shapes that and the relationship between values, just basic understandings of is this shape lighter than or darker than what's next to it? And then we'll qualify that a little bit more as we go along. Oh, and then Romero is saying, I say for you, charcoal, especially vine charcoal, will literally fall right off a hot press watercolor paper. That's good feedback. Thank you for that. Hot press that's the smooth stuff, so there's not a lot of tooth to it. All right, and now one of the things that I'm observing now is I'm trying to take note of where harder edges might be. So right here against whatever that is that's leaning against this pile of stuff. Trying to make note of. Just make a quick note and then move along. I'm trying not to render anything at this point. I'm just looking at shapes of light and dark, but now doing the subtractive drawing with the eraser. And in some way, trying to just pay attention to what are the light areas that stand out to me. This is an interesting, I love that poster or whatever it is on the wall. And then there's a little bit of something that's catching the light up here. My eyes are still out of focus when I'm doing this. I feel like I'm scowling a little bit, but my eyes are still out of focus when I'm doing this because I don't want that sharp focus to kind of pull me into wanting to create those details. Whew, this is I can feel the mental fatigue happening, so I'm really glad we're doing this in 2 weeks as a two-parter, because I do not think I'd have the mental stamina to be able to complete this in one go. There definitely was a time, especially when I was in undergrad, and we would we'd work on these big projects. I had the endurance there, the mental endurance to be able to work on a painting for 8, 10, 12 hours at a go. And I have definitely found that I've fallen out of that. And I need to reestablish my endurance. But I do think that I have to kind of remind myself that sometimes. So again, I can kind of be a bit more kind to myself, because as I reach my limit to where my focus can really be a benefit, I can, if I push it too much, then I end up just getting frustrated in the drawing and kind of beating myself up. and I don't want to get to that point. Now, one of the things that we didn't talk about that I incorporate, I think it's really kind of a helpful tool for me, is the indirect gaze. So we've, the idea that, so I have this small thumbnail that's off just below me on your screen. When I'm looking at that, I can see next to it from the overhead projection what's happening on the paper. And so if I keep fixed on the reference image, I can kind of be aware of, in the periphery, what's happening in the drawing. And so as I'm looking, for example, at maybe an angle along here, I can really kind of observe that and observe the angle out of my periphery. And that can be very different than when if I take a mental snapshot, try to hold that angle in my head, carry it over to the drawing, and then try to execute, I'll very rarely get that right. So Tom teaches that, do I have a published book? I do not, but I do have one that's in the works. So I'm waiting on a new publishing date for that, but that'll be coming out next year at some point. If you need something right away, though, I brought this up. So Brent Eviston was the guest at my art party celebrating the 100th episode a while back. And so he has this new book that came out. I'll put it right here. Art and Science of Drawing. I recommend it. A lot of good stuff. So check this out. He's got online courses with us as well. So if you go to artistnetwork.com and you type in the Art and Science of Drawing, he's got some figure drawing courses with us as well. So a lot of really good information about the fundamentals of drawing, and that's definitely a book that I would recommend for now. And then my book will be coming out sometime next year, is the hope. But in that book, I tried to model it after what we do here with the show, the idea of project-based learning, that we can give ourselves a particular challenge, and in that challenge we develop and identify specific skills. And so that really kind of aligns with how we as artists grow, is that we tackle something that's out of our comfort zone, and then we learn something new. Whether that's trying to learn how a material works, or how to tackle a subject. A lot of great art and advancements come through learning essentially how to break things, or how to use things incorrectly, break assumptions that we had, or whatnot. So it's starting to come together. So I can look at this now, and part of my goal is to create a drawing that follows a process by which I could stop at any moment and somebody could look at this and have a basic understanding of what the subject is. And I feel like we're kind of at that stage where you could look at this and say, that kind of looks like an art studio. There's not a lot of definable objects on there, but it feels like we're observing something. There's a logic to the light and shadow. There's a relationship between large and small shapes that triggers something in the viewer's mind that makes it think that this is something that exists in nature. All right, I'm seeing a lot of comments in a language which I don't speak, but oh, Brenda, if you have that book, that sounds like you've got some experience with it. I know it just came out. All right, so what am I doing here? Okay, I have my compressed charcoal now, and what that's doing is just replacing some of the very subtle and soft shapes from the vine charcoal with something that's a little bit more permanent. And if you're doing that, and I'm just using in this overhand grip, it just kind of floats on that surface. And part of what it's doing is kind of scraping off the vine charcoal, but layering on a layer of the compressed charcoal. This is actually a soft, really kind of darker charcoal pencil. So it's actually a fairly aggressive mark, but because I have that layer of vine charcoal underneath it, it's kind of accepting it a little bit better. If I had gone right to the bare paper with compressed charcoal, it might really hold it, and then it's a harder mark to kind of smooth out and unify into these larger shapes. All right, so what am I gonna do here? What am I doing? Something seems off in here. I need to give myself some more specific landmarks and really dial in the proportions now. Oh, I'm glad to hear that. Yeah, everybody check out that book, Art and Science of Drawing by Brent Evans. You can find it on Amazon, so I'll try to drop a link into that. Oh, Tom Teach just did it. Awesome. Let's see. This easel is a primary object for me, so I feel like I need to make a little bit more, I need to give it a little bit more clarity here. I need to make this a stronger anchor. There's still so much to solve here, but I feel like I've generally got the scale correct. Now, some of the things that I'll need to adjust as I start to dial it in, or say like the distance between these chair legs, the height of them, but I'm not worried about that right now. I haven't locked myself in. I can continue to adjust as we go, and that's part of that we're going to finish up next week. But I've got about another 30 minutes or so that I want to contribute to this, and I think what I want to do is set myself up so that when I start next week, after having taken a week to really observe it and think through the process, that I have a really solid foundation. And then the challenge next week becomes, where do I want to dial in the detail? Where do I want to add more refinement? So let's see, this right here, there's this dark vertical that I want to make sure I get right. And now I'm not getting the right size of it, but I'm getting closer. Now, I don't know if you can see what I did here, but to create that straight edge, this paper is aligned with this drawing board here. So I can this is long enough with this pencil extender that I can kind of lock let me see if I can bring that down. I can lock my pinky here in, kind of find the distance that I need to place this paper, and then just kind of score along down here along that side. So hopefully you can kind of see that. And if you don't have a drawing board like that, you can sometimes use the edge of the paper. So this is a thick enough paper that I can get my, here, if I can see it there, get my fingernails underneath there. Just gently, I can feel that edge of the paper there. And again, I can kind of set the distance with the pencil in my fingers and just kind of move up and down that edge that way. So that works well with vertical edges, and like this is a key one as the focal point. Getting those verticals, getting these shapes here dialed in is going to be critical. If I slope this a little bit, it's going to change everything in terms of the space. So that's why I kind of did that. And then what I want to do, that becomes a critical element for determining this angle here. So I'm going to use some angle sighting against actually I'm going to use this here. Closing one eye, aligning this with this edge of the easel. And I guess it's largely correct. I'm kind of shocked by that, actually, because when I look at it, it feels too sloped, especially when I look at it here, this angle here. And I do think it is a little bit. I think my arm had kind of twisted a little bit. So let me try that again. Yes, it is. So it's a little bit too slanted this way. I need to make it a little bit more vertical. Here's what I'll do is, here's where I'll use the ruler. I'll use a straight edge, try to find the general slope, and then use the blending stump to create an edge that's a little bit, it's just visible enough. And then along that edge, I can I can define it. I'm not going to draw a line. I'm looking for a path. And then along that path, play with the relationship between light and dark. So in this case, I see that path, and then the easel is darker than that. So then this paper here, that's kind of overlapped by the easel, I can lift out. But I can't remember who said something about how, like lifting off these lights can really pull this together. I mean, so much can be said by just focusing on the shapes of light and dark. I mean, you think about a camera, that's all a camera is doing, is looking at shapes of light and dark. And even a photo that's, out of focus and improperly exposed can carry with it a certain degree of realism. We accept it. So to move that edge over a little bit. Now we're all going to have our own kind of association with photography. Of course, we're working from a photographic source as a reference, and I think it's always, you're going to have more opportunities for growth and learning by working from a real object. Working from life will give you some more of those opportunities. So if you ever get that chance, I say take it. That being said, there's nothing inherently wrong by doing what we're doing here, drawing from a photograph. So but there's things that there's something that photography gave to artists, in that it allows us to reflect on the relationship between the artist and the subject in a really kind of interesting way. Oof, that's a horrible noise. I don't know if that's big enough in the microphone or not. Here I need to bring this edge of the whatever that is. If it's I think it's a stretcher. I don't think it's a frame, or it looks like a strainer. It's hard to tell. But giving that a little bit more information, I can darken this in here. Ooh. So using an overhand grip as much as possible, because then all that does is it keeps that point fairly sharp. And I can use that, I can use the sharp point to really kind of dial in, dial in an edge if I need it. If you are new to us, if you just joined, what you're watching is Drawing Together. My name's Scott Maier, and I stream live every Wednesday at 3 p.m. Eastern. I'm with Artist Network. And we're just here to draw together to try to improve our drawing skills, tackle a new subject each week. So feel free to check out all the other episodes that we have. Portraits, landscapes, still lifes, all of it we've covered. I try to, and we still got a lot that has yet to be explored. And if you do want to draw along, you can find the reference image in the description below, as well as the link to the show page where you can share your work when you're done. Now, if you're getting to the point where you want kind of a straight edge, one thing that you can do is mask it. So if I find that angle, and I think it's pretty close to what I have here, so I can kind of protect that edge, and I know that this side's a little bit darker in value. I can just kind of protect that edge, lift it away, and you have a bit of a sharper edge. But I don't want to, again, I don't want to score a line. Now in this case, I want to let the light and shadow lead the structure of the drawing. And so what I mean by that is we're looking at the shapes of light and dark. The alternate approach would be to follow a linear approach, where you're actually creating a line that follows along the contour of the objects. And that is, there's no right or wrong way to do it. But if my objective, though, is to create a drawing that has, a sense of light and shadow, I want that to be the thing that I lead with as I'm making my observations. So here there's an inversion of the value relationships, where now this background here becomes lighter, where the light is striking those bowls against the darker easel next to it. And then that right there, that relationship between dark and light, is what helps to create that sense of light, create that sense of depth. If I score a line there that provides a barrier and it influences that expression of those value relationships, and it impedes the understanding of light and shadow. And, the basic truth is that lines don't exist in nature. Lines are abstract constructs that we've developed as humans to represent the edge of a three-dimensional object. Those are contour lines. And lines can carry with them a lot of emotional weight, a lot of information, but they are often very difficult to use in a way that creates a sense of light and shadow. Let's see. Oh yeah, that chalkboard screeching. I hope it's not too bad. I don't know, I don't remember that screeching, that scraping noise from the charcoal ever being so noticeable in the past drawings, but maybe I just wasn't paying attention to it. So I apologize if anybody has misophonia or something like that, and and it's a really disruptive tone. Let's see how that works there. Mask that bottom edge. This right here, let's see. This gets really complicated in here. So what I'm looking at is, again, this path along here, and looking at the value relationships. So in general, this area here is darker than the easel, but then there's this, looks like a sheet of paper or something that's leaning up against there that's lighter. So it provides a gap between the that largely dark space and in the easel leg. And I'm going to change the direction of my mark. So I haven't really talked about that yet, but one of the things we talk about a lot on the show is really paying attention to the direction of your marks. Even if they're not all that visible, it is something that viewers pick up generally pretty easily. And so the reason I switched to this horizontal mark here is to contrast the vertical edge here. So what I'm telling the viewer's mind, in my own mind, is that these marks, because they run this way, are one object, and then these marks running this way, or this edge running vertically, is something different. If they're moving in the same direction, that's the mind looks at that and says, well, if these two things are moving in the same direction, they must belong together. There's that natural instinct in the mind to make things fit together. So looking at the direction of your marks is something that the brain uses to interpret that information. If they're moving in parallel, they're going to assume that they belong together. And so by changing the direction of your marks, it creates those visual clues to the brain that says, oh, wait, they're perpendicular, they're at different angles to one another, so they must be different objects. So that's something to keep in mind as well. So if you're shading on an object and the direction of your marks don't align with it, you run the risk of creating a sense of visual separation, that those marks that you're making to shade an object don't belong to the object itself. I say that, however, knowing that there are a lot of great artists that use angular hatching to create depth. You know, Leonardo being probably the first one that comes to mind. So creating a sense of shading by using marks that all are running parallel to one another, and they're separate from the form. But what makes his work is that those marks bridge objects. And so if he's shading the side of somebody's head, for example, those marks might run long and extend into that background. And so what he's actually shading is that space, not the form itself. So he's not using marks, these cross contour marks that reinforce the volume of an object. I don't, that all feels very confusing as I am saying it out loud, and so I apologize for that. But it just goes to, really just to reinforce the general notion that it's important to pay attention to the direction of your marks if you're looking to control the spatial relationships between your objects. So again, running these horizontally, because now we have this vertical edge, so those horizontal marks cut behind it. And if I want this section here to feel like it belongs to this, to feel like it belongs to this, having marks run all in that one direction helps to achieve that. If I change that up and run vertical here, diagonal here, and horizontal here, I run the risk of it not being interpreted effectively by the viewer. So, you know, you just have to see how it's playing out in your own drawing, because there are a lot of great artists that can make drawings work that way. But just ask yourself, if you're not getting the depth that you want, pay attention to the direction of your marks and see if that's serving you or if it's working against you. Okay, so just now, you know, this makes me think of Chuck Close. We talked about that in a recent episode. Chuck Close, you know, famous for his portraits that were, you know, these large collections of these small abstract paintings. So these big grids, each grid has a little tiny abstract painting in it. You step back and you see this face, all right? And we're starting to do that here. This is being divided into a type of grid. All of these lines are now subdividing the page. And so if I'm happy with the overall scale of these grids, then I can focus on the abstract qualities of light and dark within each one of these sections. Okay, so here, for example, I'm looking at these two feel like it's really kind of flat, so I'm going to create a little bit of separation by darkening this here and changing the direction of my marks to bring that forward and to push that back. All right, so that's starting to form now. And I'll see what happens if I don't know if I think these marks need to be horizontal as well. Now I didn't mask that edge, but I can kind of see that light mark that I made here. So to kind of talk about like what Leonardo might do is if, trying to create a shadow here using diagonal hatching and going just right over that edge. So in this way, the hatching doesn't align with the contour of any of those surfaces, but it affects the value relationship in a way that unifies those forms under one shadow shape. I think what I want to do is I'm just going to block this in with some cross hatching. And my main goal here is, in addition to the the screeching marks there, and my main goal is just to kind of get more compressed charcoal on the page. So hopefully all of that's making sense. Again, I'd love to hear how you all conceive of these issues. I'm gonna darken that. Now this is gonna be really, I think, an important aspect to creating a sense of stability. We talked about this vertical here, this subtle horizontal, where there's light. I messed that all together. There's light striking across the top of that surface is going to be important. So using that ruler, I'll just kind of score that, create that light. Now it's a little bit overstated, so I can come back in, kind of shave that down a little bit. And then if I carry that that implied line across, and I catch some of that light that's peeking through there, and starts to suggest that tabletop, and then there's the same right in here. I think that's going to be an important aspect, at least in my drawing, and that's what's kind of cool about this whole process, is that you may kind of lean in on different aspects of the subject than I do. So for example, you may completely underplay that tabletop and instead focus more on the chairs in front of it or something. And I'm excited to see how you all interpret this subject. Now this chair is going to be really tricky. So when I'm working on something like this, what I'm trying to avoid are heavy contour lines around the chair, because it's just going to out. But I can use some contour lines as guides. So if I keep those marks light and loose, I can give myself a little bit clearer direction as to where the paths of these legs need to go. And what I find helpful is to really identify the placement of the feet, right, and then build up from there, right? So to make sure it sits on the floor properly, that the legs feel like they're defining the shape of the chair properly. So take an angle sight between the points of contact where the feet of the chairs meet the floor. There's a little shadow that comes out. I'll grab my little Tombow Mono 0. Just a very light touch on this. Let's see. There's this other whatever rectangular object there is back there. And I want to give myself as a point of reference. So what I want to make sure that is that all of these fit together well. So one of the ways I'm also going to check that. So what I was just doing is I was comparing the placement of this to this intersection point. Where does it intersect this leg? where would it intersect this? If I draw a horizontal guide across, where does it intersect this leg and across to here? How does it relate to this? The other thing that I can look at to check the scale and the placement of that shape is this negative space in here. So this shape created in that space, does that hold up? I think what I need to do is I'm getting some kind of directional marks that are challenging. So I'm going to, if you're not sure what direction of mark to make, then use a circular mark. Just kind of blend it this way, and it's fairly omnidirectional. I can feel my brain breaking a little bit right now, so I'm getting a little fatigued. We're coming up on 2 hours, but I feel like what we're doing now is getting set up to effectively come back next week and finish this up. So again, I talked about at the top of the show, one of the things that this is providing us is an ability to practice just really analyzing the work over some time. So now we just set this aside. You know, we've just primed our minds to think about this problem. So I know over the next week, part of my mental energy will be going to thinking about this drawing. And I'm going to come back to this with some fresh perspectives and fresh ways of thinking about it. So I'm going to set this aside. Now you can see when I created this initial stage, I got a little bit farther along. This, I don't know as if, you know, there's a difference in scale between some of these things. And I might need to continue to adjust, you know, taking a little bit longer because I'm talking through it a bit more than I do when I'm talking to myself. But I want to be evaluating things throughout the week. Essentially using the same tools that I use to develop this drawing. Here, I'll be looking at it through blurred focus. Maybe I'll flip it upside down, or I'll hold it in front of a mirror. Whenever I change the relationship between myself and the drawing, it's going to give me an opportunity to identify something that seems off. My brain is kind of calibrated to this orientation and is starting to invent things that don't exist. I'm seeing things as being correct when they're not, or incorrect when they are. And I need some space away from that in order to really observe it objectively. And so that's what this next week is going to give me. So again, I'm going to use some of those tools, maybe take a photo of it and look at it in the thumbnail from my camera to see what happens when I really shrink it down. I might keep working on this a little bit off screen and come back to it next week. Maybe throughout the week I'll kind of pick away at it. If I do anything like that, I'll talk through some of the changes I've made between now and then. So, but there, I do want to kind of address some of the questions that I've been a little bit focused on. So I haven't been able to look at the questions. Tammy said there's a tripod or something in front of the chair messing me up. Yes, that is a pain in the butt. That, in this initial attempt, really threw me off. And to be honest, one of the reasons I focused more on this section today is because of that darn thing. That is really throwing me off. And so here's the thing that I found more helpful in the preparatory drawing is using the blending stump to indicate that, just because it's a more gentle mark. There's a lot of fine edges in there, but what happens is that it's such a neutral tone that is difficult to determine whether it's lighter or darker than something else. It's really bizarre. So you can see I have like this gentle, like kind of subtle mark in here. And you might see what happens if you kind of indicate that tripod using the blending stump, looking at two primary things. The angle, so using angle sighting, and then identifying the placement on the floor relative to everything else. So where is it relative to this back chair leg? Where is it relative to this object or this chair over here? And be open, like this, for example, I don't think I had placed this chair leg properly. And so that might affect things. You know, I haven't really calculated that out. But you know, see what happens when you do that, because now you've divided that up and you can start to kind of carve into it a little bit. So now that leg that cuts behind there, you can try to capture, but try to do it in a fairly gentle way, so that it's not overstated. And if you need to, you can then use the edge of your eraser to lift a little bit more. But again, just be really gentle at first before you apply too much pressure. You want to sneak up on it. And one of the things that I kind of have running in my mind about this, whatever tripod thing is, it looks like it's like a handheld pottery wheel or something, or maybe that you would put your ceramics on and then as you're glazing it, maybe kind of turning it. That's what my assumption that it is. You know, when I first looked at this scene, I didn't notice it. That gives me an indicator that, you know, that's a very subtle object with regards to value, contrast, and things like that. There can be a tendency sometimes when you notice little and subtle things like that to overstate. That's what I do, is I would observe something like this and I'm like, oh my gosh, there's this tripod-y thing here. I need to make that clear so the viewer knows it's there too. And then I'll overstate it and it'll feel kind of clumsy. So I just kind of keep in mind that if I didn't notice it at first, then I don't want the viewer to notice it first either when they look at the drawing for the first time. So hopefully that makes sense. So just kind of sneak up on it, try to adjust it, and you know, indicate it with just subtle marks. Sometimes even just doing that, like placing, you know, just placing the feet, the point of contact on the floor, can sometimes be enough for the viewer to fill in missing information. So if you get the placement of these three properly, really looking at that angle, and that angle, so that really shallow triangle that's created there, sometimes that can be enough. So I'm just, because that was brought up, I'm going to stick a little bit more with this, so then if you're working on it on your own, you have some tools to work with. Let me see, what other questions are there? I'll keep working on this while other questions come in. If there's anything that anybody wants me to demonstrate before we head into next week, before we call it a day here, let me know. Let's see. I don't know what. And there's a lot of stuff typed in the chat for which I'm not able to read, so I apologize. Let's see. And unfortunately, Wilma, I have to be the one to step in if it's bothering everybody to have all of the chat in here that's difficult to read. So that's on me. Let's see. Okay, no, it looks like it's all good. I just want to make sure that I did get everybody's question properly. Oh, Thomas is saying, one hot mess. I have charcoal everywhere, the paper, the drafting table, my hands, my face. Yikes. Sorry about that. That happens here too, especially with my computer equipment. I have to be really careful with. And so as I'm going to pack everything up, I want to make sure I don't get charcoal everywhere, and especially now that it's all over my hands. This is actually not too bad. I often get even dirtier. But yeah, I think, we're 2 hours in. I think we're set up. That's all right, Wilma, no worries. I appreciate it. Let's see. I used to have a volunteer admin, but we just have too many things going on here at the company that they got pulled away, and I said that's all right, I can handle it. And today got a little bit out of control, but that's all right. I don't know what was being said. I apologize if you're asking questions in a language I don't understand. I apologize for not being able to get to it. All right, it's all good. It's been a great week. I am happy with how this has started. I hope you're happy with your drawings. If not, we'll learn from it. Again, if you want to post your work on artistnetwork.com and you are looking for specific feedback from the group, feel free to type that in your comments when you post it. So you have to be logged into Artist Network in order to post the comment. Just help us by kind of identifying what type of feedback you're looking for. So if you're saying, hey, I'm having a hard time with this technique, or this doesn't feel like it's the right shape or size, need some of those observations that can help us direct our feedback. Because there is an art to asking for feedback, delivering feedback, and then implementing the feedback. And so it takes some practice. And if you have any questions about that I can help with, let me know. Because it can be messy. Nobody wants anybody's feelings to get hurt, but we also want to feel like we're actually contributing and helping somebody by providing feedback. But just my general take on it is I don't provide suggestions for improvement unless specifically asked for, and it can be helpful to have some sort of direction, what type of feedback, so then it can be that feedback can be more easily applied to your own work. So. Excellent. This has been a fun one. Like I said, I don't know about you. If I didn't have coffee this morning, I've got some tea right now. If I didn't have the caffeine, I'd be in a world of hurt. But I could feel my brain is already kind of shutting down. So I think I need a week away from this drawing. I'm going to come back to it next week. I'll probably work on my preparatory drawing a little bit more to help me think through the next stages for this one here. But I also want to save as much as I can for next week. We'll be able to get into it and get some nice juicy details in there. So awesome. Yes, Tammy, good luck with your surgery. I really hope that goes well. And for everybody, I hope you're all happy, healthy, drawing. And I'm happy to see everybody supporting one another. So thank you. I will see you all next week.